Hi, welcome back and thanks for watching again. My name is Arito. Today we're going to be doing a fun little mod to our breadboard overdrive. I'm not sure, but I don't think there's an actual pedal out there that has something similar to this. But obviously I could be totally wrong because I do not know every single pedal out there and I do not know all the schematics that are available out there. So anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to add an FET gain stage at the very end of our op-amp based breadboard overdrive. And so if you followed along in previous videos and built your own breadboard overdrive, this is going to be a really fun little mod and little addition that you could do to get that kind of JFET or FET type breakup. But if you have something similar, if you built your own pedals or whatever, maybe this could be a fun idea for you to do some further mods to your own pedals. But we're not going to talk too much in this intro right now. I just want to dive into the schematics and what we're going to be doing and how we're going to achieve those tones. And so we're following along in the tones from a previous video I did a couple weeks ago, where I compared a regular soft clipping overdrive against a FET breakup overdrive. So we're trying to recreate that FET breakup and that fat early Marshall Plexi Tweed Bassman type tone using the pre-existing breadboard overdrive. Obviously it's not really just about the FET versus soft clipping. The frequency response and the tonal response is going to be much more important when building this type of pedal. And so we are going to be addressing that as well. Anyway, enough talking. Let's go into the schematic, take a look at what we'll be doing today. And then later on, I'll have some loop comparisons comparing the MOSFET overdrive from the previous videos against this modded breadboard overdrive. So let's just dive into that, and I hope you enjoy the video. Okay, so we're first going to take a look at the schematic, and this is the now very familiar, or should be very familiar, breadboard overdrive schematic. And nothing has been changed from when I first introduced this in that video many months ago. So here is today's schematic. Okay, and so the first thing we're going to do is remove the two feedback clipping diodes, and that's just going to make it into a strictly op-amp based gain stage. So I've highlighted the more important parts that we do need to have to achieve this tone today, and these are going to be the red parts of the schematic. And so first we are going to change the resistor coming off of the gain knob and the inverting op-amp stage. We had a 5.6K and a 0.047 microfarad on the original schematic, and we've changed that to a 10K and a 0.01 microfarad, but we've also added a second one, and so this is again going to be a 10K and a 0.15 microfarad capacitor. And this type of topology where you see two sort of parallel pairs of a resistor and capacitor is pretty common. You'll find it in the RAT. I think the DS1 has it, and a bunch of other pedals will have this. And so what that's doing is you're setting two bass cutoff frequencies, and so you have one cutoff frequency with this, and so that's going to cut off the bass at a certain frequency, and then with this you're going to be cutting it off again at a different frequency. And so by doing that, you end up having a more complex bass cutoff curve. And I added that so that we can have a little more low mids to get it sound closer to the MOSFET overdrive that we had. And that's going to give a little more low end thump and punch to make it sound like sort of that early JTM Marshall Plexi Fender Bassman type sound. So anyway, so yes, definitely change that and you'll have something completely different compared to what the original breadboard overdrive sounded like, especially in the lower mids. And you could even just stop there and add the clipping diodes, or change this to a hard clipping circuit and then have a great sounding fat distortion. But the main focus of today's video is to add that extra gain stage with the JFET, and so that's what this part is. And I've intentionally left everything here blank because these resistors, the resistor on the drain and the resistor on the source, is going to change depending on what JFET you use. And so just to give you what I used, first I had a 2SK34 JFET here, and that was a JFET made by Mitsubishi way back when, and so they're no longer in production, but I used that just because I kind of liked the way it sounded. I also plugged in a 2SK170, which is a very popular JFET made by Toshiba, favorite among people in the hi-fi audio community, but I just didn't like the way it sounded. And I preferred the 2SK34 here a little bit more. It was a very subtle difference, but you could definitely hear it in the breakup. And if you go deep into JFET biasing, you'll learn quickly that JFETs are kind of all over the map as far as tolerances go. And so even for the exact same JFET, so let's just take the 2SK170, the tolerance values for certain specs on the JFET are going to be all over the place, but that's still going to be within spec for that JFET. And so what a lot of people do is they will grab a whole pile of JFETs and they'll measure each individual component for what's called the IDSS, and then the pinch off voltage, which is the VGS off. And you can go deep into that. I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff today. So if you are interested in learning more about JFETs and JFET biasing, there are plenty of videos and online blogs and tutorials going deep into that stuff and teaching you how to measure that stuff as well. So I recommend you look into that. In our case, it's not going to make a huge difference because we are intentionally going to be clipping that JFET. And so, but if you're building like a high-end audio preamp or something like that, like a hi-fi thing, you do want to measure each JFET. And just to tell you what my values were for the resistor coming off the source, I had a 2.4K, and then for the resistor coming off the drain, I had a 5.6K. And actually, those are not the correct values for your optimal biasing point. I measured the IDSS and the pinch-off voltage for that particular 2SK34 that I used, and the optimal resistor values came out to be something like 580 ohm here and like a 3.3K here. I think that's what I got. And I started off with those values, but because we are slamming that JFET with plus or minus 4.5 volts of signal, because we are probably going to be clipping it already in the second op amp stage, and so because of the way we are slamming the JFET, it just didn't sound right with the optimal resistor values for biasing this JFET. And so I just ended up going into the circuit and just plugging in a bunch of different resistors. So for whatever FET that you are going to be using, that value is going to change. And so I suggest you plug in different resistors and just experiment with that. I think a lot of those optimal resistor values are for if you wanted to use this as your first input transistor in a hi-fi type circuit. And so if you wanted to use it as your input gain stage, which is where a lot of JFETs are typically used, those values might be the best. They might not end up sounding all that great in this type of a circuit because we are wanting to clip it and get that clipping sound from this JFET. It's kind of a unique way to be using a JFET, and probably not what your typical circuit designers would be thinking of. So, long-winded story, but I recommend that you just plug in a bunch of different resistors and play around with different values to see what sounds the best. And again, for the JFET, just get a hold of whatever you can. I think the more common JFETs available overseas would be like a J201 or a J110 112, I think. I'm not too familiar with the JFETs available outside of Japan, but I think those are some of the JFETs I've heard of used in a lot of pedals. And so yeah, so that's taking a look at the schematic. I guess the important thing is to have this section so that you do get that low mid push, and you get a fatter sound compared to the more typical mid-humped overdrive sound that we had in the basic form of the breadboard overdrive, and then also adding this output JFET stage to be clipping it. One thing I will add is that just to do some very minor tweaks, and you don't have to do this, I changed this to a 20K just to lower the gain of that second op amp stage just a little bit. And then I also changed the tone capacitor to a 0.0082 microfarads, and that's just a very small change. So it's not going to make a noticeable difference, but I did that just to sort of fine tune the tones. And that's about it. And so let's move on into the actual breadboard and hear how it sounds, and then we'll do some loop comparisons at the end. Okay, so now we're looking at the breadboard and the pedals, and this already has the FET gain stage built into it. So I'm just going to go through the tones real quick, but I have a shootout between the MOSFET overdrive and the FET added breadboard later on using the same loops I had a couple weeks ago. So I'm not really going to do an in-depth comparison between the two right now, but let's just hear what it sounds like. I am on my red Strat. This is the neck pickup, and let's start off the clean tone. Okay, and I'm going to turn on the this is the breadboard overdrive with the added FET gain stage, and so you can see that they sound really close. I would have a hard time distinguishing the two. And so let's do a couple more licks. Let's go into the middle position on the Strat. Let's see. Okay, again, they sound very close, but obviously because they have different tone stacks, if you were to start tweaking around with the tone knobs, they are going to start to sound quite different to each other. But right now, as it is, this is the tone knob is at noon, and you probably can't see it, but the trim pot for the tone on the breadboard overdrive is also at noon. Gain is at similar place. 2 o'clock, that's closer to 1 o'clock maybe, but they do sound very close. And so instead of going through the breadboard FET in depth, what I do want to do is I want to swap the resistor that is on the drain of the FET. And I'm going to swap that. Right now I have a 5.6K in there, and I'm going to swap it with a 47K. And let's see what happens with that. Okay, so I swapped the resistor on the drain with a 47K, so that's almost 10 times the value that we had earlier, which was a 5.6K. And again, on the middle pickup on the Strat, this is what it sounds like. Okay, so it becomes a totally gated fuzz type sound because the bias point is not at its optimal bias point, it starts to get really gated and crazy sounding. And so that's just a fun thing you could do if you were to build this yourself. If you wanted to have fun beyond your typical FET gain stage with that heavy, nice distortion, you can make it into sort of a gated fuzz sound. And let's play around with this a little more. And that trail off of that gated sound is really cool. And then also with a gated fuzz, if you were to attack the strings and then immediately sort of palm mute it or finger mute it on your left hand, it shuts off, but then slowly comes back again. So let's try that. Hopefully you can hear that. It makes you hear that first attack, and then it goes dead quiet, and then you hear the harmonic right after that slowly kind of creep in. So what I'm doing there is I play the note, and without doing a direct slide, I lift my finger very gently, and so that it sort of quiets the string, but then slide down and press down on the 5th fret. And with that gated sound, you almost end up having sort of an octave fuzz. It's not really quite an octave fuzz, but if you were to play up here on above the 12th fret, you get something like this. Okay, and just for fun, let's go into the bridge. And so that's really fun because it sort of cuts off the note without really wanting to. So I wasn't trying to cut off the note, but I was probably just naturally muting it in a certain way, and then that sort of shuts off the gate for a moment and it cuts off the note, so it just doesn't sound like I was expecting it to sound. And so obviously you could use different resistor values. I used the 47K here, and so we started off with a 5.6K, so anywhere in between, or you could even go beyond that to get some more crazy gated fuzz sounds. But I think if you get too high, it's going to not really function properly anymore, and you probably won't really be able to get any decent usable sounds. But anywhere in between, so you could use like a 30K if you wanted to, 20K, 24K, or whatever, and you could kind of find some in between, almost gated sounds. Like it'll probably gate when you hit the strings really hard, but when you play softly, it'll be somewhat usable. Okay, so that's a fun thing you could try. And as I said earlier, I'm not going to go too in depth with the breadboard overdrive with the added FET, because I invite you all to do the same and experiment and try out different things. This breadboard overdrive is so simple and so basic that you could do fun stuff like this and add a bunch of stuff to make it into something very different sounding. And so the purpose of this video isn't really to demonstrate this particular circuit itself, but to invite you all to join in. If you built your own breadboard overdrive, to invite you all to join in and do something crazy like this and have fun with it. Or if you wanted to have that kind of thick Marshall-esque sound that we got with the MOSFET overdrive, this is something you could add to your pre-existing circuit and make it sort of into an early JTM slash Plexi style overdrive. So yeah, that's about it. And let's move on into the loop comparisons. And so towards the end, I'll have sort of a blindfold quiz type segment where you'll be hearing the MOSFET overdrive against the breadboard with the added FET, but I won't be showing which pedal is which. And so I want you guys to join in and see if you can guess which clip is which pedal. So that'll be towards the end. But anyway, let's jump into some loop comparisons between the two pedals. I decided not to include this into the comparison just to keep it very simple. So this ended up not being used today, but we're going to compare the two and see how close they sound or how different they sound. So let's move on into the next segment.